about our all-party group and the work that we're doing in the run-up COP26 this year before introducing what is an incredible set of guests that we've got today of colleagues, former colleagues, and others from the sector. So the Net Zero APPG was formed to unlock a low carbon, secure and affordable future by generating and shaping debate. And we seek to inform and influence a future policy direction to embed zero carbon solutions and get a net zero roadmap in this country. We published a 10-point plan, which we sent last year to everybody you could think of, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the now President, who was the Base Secretary at the time. And this event today is part of a series of events that we are undertaking in the run-up to COP26. And we have a roadmap report, which we're going to publish ahead of COP26, which today's session will contribute to. Obviously, we've just had the budget last week. And so this is a post-budget opportunity to discuss and debate how we can accelerate the UK's net zero economy, level up investment, create green jobs, deliver economic stability, and ultimately achieve a green recovery from the pandemic. So we're going to go to each of the speakers. Oh, I need to do housekeeping first. Yeah, each of the speakers and who've been set some questions to respond to. So I mean, hopefully everybody can see housekeeping, but I'll just summarise it quickly. We're being recorded. Please do go online and tweet and share what's happening. You can use the chat function to put questions forward, which I will then utilise, which hopefully we'll have time for. It's a very tight session today, but hopefully we'll have time for some questions. And so please do use that function. I'll try and pick some questions out. And we'll try and mute our mics while we're not speaking during this. So without any further ado, I'm just going to check my agenda to remind me who's speaking first. And then I'll introduce the speakers as we go. So first up, this is where my laptop decided not to play with me. I'm just going to arbitrarily pick somebody to go first. I can't find my agenda now. So we've got two. Hold on. Yep, here we go. Sorry, I've found it now. So we're going to start with my colleague on the shadow front bench, Abena Oppong-Asare, who is the Shadow Exchequer Secretary. And I'm really pleased that Abena's been able to join us today, who I know has got a deep passion on the climate and climate issues and is leading our work around tax and economic policy. So over to you, Abena.
Hi, thank you, Alex. Can I just say I'm very impressed you pronounced my name right. I know you can. Can you hear me, everybody? That's good. So my name is Abena Oppong-Asare. I'm the MP for Erith and Thamesmead, and as Alex just mentioned, I'm the Shadow Exchequer Secretary in the Shadow Treasury team. I'm pleased to be here to talk about essentially the budget, what we're doing at the moment, and I just really wanted to say that I think what we do need to see from the government in particular is more needs to be done to meet our net zero commitments and to ensure that there is a just transition that essentially creates jobs right across the country. Last week when was the budget announcement, as most of you, all of you will know, and I'm afraid that we didn't see in the budget from the Chancellor anything really about a green recovery package. We all know that this is a critical moment, both for the climate emergency and also the possibility of jobs-led recovery. I see it in the emails that I get from constituents on a regular basis, and also through various stakeholders who I've been meeting, who have been talking about the green recovery and what businesses could be doing to play their role in that as well. We do need to see from the government, we do really need to see a budget that recognises and does come up with a stimulus and a plan to meet the challenges we do face, particularly as we are emerging out of the COVID, doing our recovery following COVID. One of the things I am concerned about is, at the moment, the government has actually cut £500,000 of, I'd say, capital investment from their plans for the coming year. So the Greens Homes Grant, which was a flagship programme of the Chancellor's statement last year, has disappeared completely. And that's after more than 75% of its funding was cut. As a party, what Labour has done, one of the things that we are pushing for and through our recommendations is the 30 billion green economic recovery, which would create 400,000 jobs in clean industries. And this is really what we feel is the scale of ambition that is really needed across the country to be able to move forward in terms of having meeting our net zero targets. And so from investing in electric battery development and green energy, green steel technology, this will help secure essentially what we see as long-term future for our manufacturing industry, to invest in offshore wind, to create jobs in coastal communities. There's been a lot of discussion about this, and as a party, we feel very strongly this would help deliver net zero transition and help create the opportunities that we do need across the country. Before I'll turn to some of the specifics in the budget, it's important that I welcome the fact that there is a national infrastructure bank. This is something that, as Labour, we've been calling for some time. But what it does do is it does replace the Green Infrastructure Bank, which the government scrapped in 2017. And according to the OBR, the new bank will essentially provide less than half the funding we used to receive from the European Investment Bank. And so that is kind of a concern in my eyes. The Committee on Climate Change have also told us the finance for low carbon investments will essentially need to grow from around 10 billion a year in 2020 to 15 billion by 2030, a year by 2030. So in this context, what that means, the initial capitalisation of the new bank is far too low. So really it needs to be about 20 billion at a bare minimum over the next 4 or 5 years. This is what the Committee on Climate Change has said. This is not just what, this isn't just a figure that's been plucked by from the Labour Party. I think it's really important to highlight that we do need clarity from the government that the bank will have a watertight net zero mandate that can be used to fund high emitting projects. And also on the Green Homes Grant, it's clear, unfortunately, that we will not meet our net zero targets if we don't grasp the heating and insulation challenge. So we do, one of the recommendations is that we do need to see the government set out a clear replacement plan to insulate the nation's homes and provide more good jobs and processes. I just want to say also, because I know that you've got a tight schedule and I'm very keen to stick to my time, and I can see Alex looking at me intently. I just want to finish by saying I do think that climate change and the path to net zero, as I've said already, was absent in the budget. It's extremely disappointing because as Labour, we feel that our economic recovery from COVID and our transition to net zero must go hand in hand. And this is from conversations that I've had with various stakeholders and businesses who have also said the same to me about that. And so I just want to say the budget was obviously, for me, a clear opportunity for us to kind of have that set out. So I do hope that the government does come up with something better in months to come. And I'm going to stop there.
Muted. Thanks, Abena. That was great. We're next going to move on to Mike Hemsley, who's the lead for carbon budgets on the CCC. We do a lot of work with the CCC, and I'm not sure when the last time we had an event without somebody from the CCC was on. So it's great to have Mike here, because carbon budgets can be immensely important, particularly around the COP negotiations. So over to you, Mike.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. And yes, we never miss an opportunity to talk about net zero. So very happy to be here today. For those of you who may not know what the Climate Change Committee is, I'll just briefly introduce what we do. So we're an independent government advisor, and our job is to say, well, given the UK's long-term targets for net zero emissions in 2050, how do we think we should be meeting those? And what's the pathway towards net zero in 2050? And the most recent piece of work we did on this was called the Sixth Carbon Budget. So this is our advice to government on what we think the pathway to 2050 should be, and specifically the level of emissions that the UK should restrict itself to during the 2030s. And what we said is that the UK should embrace an ambitious pathway towards this net zero target, particularly as host of COP26 this year. The UK should be seen to be leading the pack. And we recommended a reduction in emissions of 78% by 2035, based on 1990 levels. And just for a bit of context, we've reduced emissions about just over 40% based on 1990 levels already to date. So it's an ambitious increase on that. But also, just 2 years ago, we were saying that the 2050 target was an 80% reduction. And now basically we're saying that's where we need to be by 2035, 80% reduction in emissions on a UK level. What does that actually mean in practice? That means by 2035, every new thing you buy, every new piece of infrastructure, every new piece of kit needs to be the low carbon thing rather than the high carbon thing. And then that means that you've got a chance for the stock to turn over, so that by 2050, you've got net zero emissions. Everything then is low carbon. So instead of buying a fossil fuel vehicle in the 2030s, you should be buying an electric vehicle, and government should be providing the incentives to do that. Similar for gas boilers, heating systems, and bits of industrial kit as well as making sure we're scaling up nature-based investments and things like that. So that's the vision that we presented to government in December. And we're already seeing that government's starting to accept and embrace that, which is great. First of all, they've accepted our near-term recommendation on a nationally determined contribution to submit to the UN, saying what the UK is going to reduce its emissions to by 2030. So they've accepted a 64% reduction there. And the next step for us would, and the next step we see in kind of a green recovery is the government and Parliament legislating the Sixth Carbon Budget in the 2030s. Because consistently when we go out to industry, what we hear from people is, if you give us that long-term vision, we will invest in low carbon solutions in the UK, and that could start to scale up. So we think we've presented a vision to government there. Government's starting to embrace it. And what we want to see really is government legislate that budget and then bring forward the strategies that dictate how they think they're going to meet it. The good thing is government's promised that already. So there's two key strategies that I'd point you to amongst the myriad of strategic documents the government's going to produce this year. One is a comprehensive net zero strategy, which they're looking to publish before COP. And the other is Treasury's net zero review, which is due to be published before the summer, I believe. And both of those should take a comprehensive look at what needs to be done, both for net zero and the Sixth Carbon Budget, and put the UK on a pathway to meet those, and take a look at some of the challenges as well as the opportunities. And I particularly point you to the Treasury's net zero review for that. So that's kind of the long-term picture. And what you'd expect is the government needs to steer the country towards that trajectory gradually, because we're not deploying these things at scale at the moment, and we need all of these things to be deployed at scale. We need heat pumps, which we only install, say, 20 to 30,000 a year at the moment, to reach a market size of 1 million plus by 2030. Similar for electric vehicles, they're only 3% of new vehicle sales over the last couple of years. They need to be 100% by 2030. We need to scale all of those things up. So at some point, you'd expect the short term to match the long term. And that's where I just talked about the budget last week. I think it's fair to say it wasn't a green budget. I think it's probably also fair to say, in these COVID times, you probably wouldn't expect it to necessarily be that green of a budget. You wouldn't expect net zero to be the main focus of it. There were some things in there which suggests that net zero is going to be more of a focus, and we'd really hope to see more of a focus in Treasury documents after the publication of the net zero review. For example, changing fuel duty, rebalancing of gas and electricity prices, and more long-term green programs as well. In terms of the opportunities from this net zero transition, we've consistently identified that the things we want from the sixth carbon budget can be good green recovery policies as well. And one specific recommendation there is a program of buildings retrofit, both for energy efficiency and low carbon heat deployment. The government made a really ambitious start with that with the Green Homes Grant last year. And there is some concern that this is probably its flagship green recovery program, and it's getting off to a poor start. What we want to see is that marriage of the short-term and long-term vision continue over time. So we keep seeing more and more net zero programs come forward from government there. And then just lastly, I'll point you again to the forthcoming Treasury net zero review, which should be the first time central government's really had a look at the challenges and opportunities comprehensively. We've taken a look at this as part of the sixth carbon budget, and we're clear that actually the sixth carbon budget can lead to green jobs and can lead to green growth, both over the long term and over the short term. But there are challenges as well. It's going to necessitate people changing in some areas what they do, the transition skills away from oil and gas towards low carbon solutions, away from fossil fuel vehicles towards low carbon vehicles, and plenty more examples like that. And increasingly, the world is acknowledging this. And it's up for the UK to grasp the opportunity here. Every month, every year that goes by, that the UK is not investing in the electric vehicle transition means that we're going to be buying batteries from Europe instead of building batteries in the UK. So now really is the time to be seizing that opportunity, grasping the long-term vision and saying, look, here's what we're going to do in the short term to make sure we're on track to that. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Mike, that was really helpful. That was really helpful in framing this. Next, we've got Kevin Hollingbrake. Kevin's the chair of the Fair Business Banking APPG, and he also secured a debate last November on SMEs and net zero, which we've both spoken. And I know how passionate Kevin is about SMEs and the role they can have in net zero. So over to you, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Thanks for inviting me. Yes, MP Thurston Moulton in North Yorkshire, not too far away from Alex's constituency. And yes, I mean, most of my life I've been in business rather than Parliament. So you're right to say I'm a massive advocate of SMEs. And I thought it was an excellent presentation from Mike. And I think all that decarbonisation that we've already achieved in this country, which is pretty much world leading, has principally been delivered by the private sector. So what we're focusing on the APPG, which principally looks at the relationship between banking and business, is how we provide the strategic framework for businesses and take businesses with us on this journey, because we know they're the ones that will deliver this decarbonisation. So what the government's got to do is set the framework and the strategic goals around that and the regulatory nudges around that. So then, and in as consistent a way as possible, so businesses can plan for the future, because businesses will invest in these huge business opportunities that are going to come alongside our race to net zero, as long as they see that the policy provisions, the policies are going to be with us for a while. So what you don't want is a change in policy halfway through that really deters investment. So a long-term strategic framework with milestones, and Mike set out some of the milestones we're looking to achieve and the acceleration of those milestones, which we would all support. But business has got to cope with this, of course. And of course, it's coping with an awful lot right now. So it was inevitable that this was going to be a COVID recovery budget, because lots of businesses are just trying to stay in business rather than thinking, okay, I need to decarbonise at the same time. So, but we know that train is coming hurtling down the track. So the key thing for us on the APPG is, as we see this transition, what we're going to see is banks increasingly say to be under pressure from the shareholders and the customers to say, we're on this journey too, and we're going to decarbonise our businesses and we're going to decarbonise our supply chains. Also, they're going to start saying to their customers, we want you to decarbonise too. and that's going to bring about a change in lending policy, and not in a dissimilar way, and hopefully a different way, how they'll put it into practice, of how lending policy changed post 2008, and that had a catastrophic effect on thousands of businesses. We don't want to see that again. What we need to make sure our banks do is help our businesses to decarbonise, and that's going to mean it comes at a time when lots of businesses are struggling under a lot of debt anyway because of what's happened over the last year. So that's no mean feat in trying to make sure banks will provide the finance to decarbonise. If I can give you a simple example, I've got a very good business in my constituency that's called the York Handmade Brick Company. It does what it says on the tin. It fires its bricks in a kiln that's fired by natural gas. Now, it's not impossible to decarbonise that process, use biogas or electric kilns, but that's going to take investment by that company. So we need to make sure that banks don't simply say, I'm sorry, you're an old-fashioned business, we don't like you. They actually provide the capital for that business to decarbonise. So really important that we engage the banks in this conversation as well to help SMEs deliver on these net zero objectives. So we've got this work stream called Bankers for Net Zero. It is that collaboration discussions between banks. In fact, Nigel Topping's one of our team on this particular journey. But it's banks, it's SMEs, it's regulators, it's NGOs, it's academia, and the UN, in fact. So we put a report together in November about the strategic approach that we need to take the private sector with us on this journey. And we're looking now at things like retrofits, and Mike mentioned retrofits in his comments there. So yes, heat pumps are a tiny fraction of the markets at the moment, and we need to be able to scale that up. And of course, as we install more of these heat pumps, the cost comes down, the cost of installation, the cost of the boilers themselves. But at the moment, it's pretty expensive to deep retrofit a house, or even make a brand new house carbon neutral. So, but that cost will come down over time. So we need to make sure that the government support is there. £9 billion commitment, of course, for retrofits in this Parliament. Green Homes Grant hasn't been an unbridled success. It's fair to say, because it was rushed out, I think, and both the administration and system wasn't there, and the contractors weren't there. So that's why we need these strategic frameworks. We need the customers to buy into it. We need to make sure that the finance is workable. The Green Deal, of course, was notoriously bad in terms of how that works. So lots of challenges that we need to tackle. But if we take that long-term strategic approach to these things and make sure that the private sector thinks the kind of incentives that are going to be here today, of course, are going to taper, because you need to pump prime these things and then taper them, but in a way that the rug isn't pulled from under businesses after they've invested in these things. So we need the owners to invest, we need tenants, we need social housing providers to do that. Finally, just on the UK Investment Bank, a great move in Leeds as well, Alex, which I'm sure you love it being there, but 12 billion, which will be leveraged up to about 40 billion quid of investment, clean energy, and those objectives to meet zero emissions by 2050. We think it'll be a really important opportunity for SMEs to get finance to be able to help make this transition.
Thank you, Kevin. And next we've got two Carolines, both of whom have served in respective shadow cabinets in this policy area and are now collaborating on a new venture, Onward. And Onward have recently launched a commission, Getting to Zero. So it's absolutely timely to have the Carolines on the call. And we're going to start with Caroline on my side of the aisle, Caroline Flint, who was Shadow Secretary of State for Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs, shadowing the coalition government of 2010 to 2015. So over to you, Caroline.
Mute. Sorry about that. So actually, Alex, I was the Shadow Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change from 2011 to 2015. And as you said, Caroline and we should form the band actually, Caroline, shouldn't we really? We are co-chairing a programme Getting to Zero. And I thought I might just say a little bit about what that's all about. We are looking at how the green transition can be aligned to economic recovery, how it can turbocharge green growth, and importantly, as someone who is a former Northern MP, but also obviously Caroline in the Midlands as well, how we can level up productivity rates and employment throughout the UK. Especially, we've been looking at what are known as sometimes the red wall areas, the left behind communities. And I think we, and I'm sure everybody on this panel today recognises that it's absolutely fundamental that we make the transition to net zero. That is non-negotiable. We also, I think, all recognise there are massive opportunities to rethink how we do business, how we do our economy, how we make things, how we live our lives, and huge numbers of opportunities in that for everyone to benefit from socially and economically. But we do need to do some serious thinking about how the green economy currently affects our communities across the country. Where are the low carbon jobs? Where are the high emitting jobs? And look at what has transformed those part of our countries to a more low carbon employment pattern, and what is stopping others from making the same change. And we are looking at three core components, Alex. We are looking at a large-scale analysis of key incumbent industries from agriculture, aviation, waste, energy, construction, and so on. I think about 10 different areas. How these incumbent industries are faring at the moment and where they need to get to by 2030, let alone 2050. And some of Mike's percentages there of what we need to achieve are really daunting, I have to say, and some of these industries and sectors are better placed than others. But also the research we want to do on green skills and jobs opportunity, and we're also looking at future innovation to really materially drive down or capture emissions at the pace required. And of course, that final point around innovation goes to the very heart of what some colleagues have already talked about, is what are the financial incentives to make people put money into those areas so we can actually get them from an idea to a product to being used and scaled up. But we've also, in our initial launch report, Alex, focused on mapping across the UK communities and looking at where jobs and their GVA is connected to high emitting work that will not be able to continue in the same way going forward. And just a few headlines from that, if I may. 43% of workers in the so-called red wall areas work in currently high emitting industries compared to 37% in the rest of the UK. I think we, for every one job lost in London, we lose 4 in Yorkshire and the Humber because of the nature of the jobs that we have if we don't do anything to transform the future of that work and offer other choices. In total, we recognise that there's about up to something like 10 million jobs are in industries that to reach net zero by 2050 are either going to have to be replaced, redesigned, and substantial retraining going on for the workers in them. And these are also people and places that have the most to gain actually through our change to a cleaner and greener future, because many of these communities have already suffered from deindustrialisation, but also missing out on some of the opportunities that the more affluent parts of our economy have benefited from. And that goes to the heart of, regional imbalances in the way our economy is structured. That was important before even anyone talked about climate change, but actually climate change offers us a chance to rethink those economies and rethink what rebalancing and regionalisation means to us going forward. So there is a moral obligation and urgency to act in terms of the climate emergency, but there's also an economic urgency to this as well, which I think forces all of us to think about what we can do. And there is no doubt there are opportunities here. It's interesting about you know, the budget last week, and I can understand the comments that have been made about it was a COVID recovery budget and that was the focus, and you know, and I get that. But it seemed to me that, you know, at every public opportunity, we need people in power to be drawing the connections between something that may not seem to have a connection, but in some ways does. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. We've all been living through and are still living through this pandemic that has affected all of us. It has challenged everybody in the country, as individuals, as families, as communities, as business people, as politicians, to make huge changes to our lives in last year. And I thought there was actually a bit of a missed opportunity in the budget for the Chancellor not to maybe draw some parallels between facing something like a pandemic, which of course we've had to and will continue to have to deal with that, and facing this enormous challenge of climate change. Because if you're talking about COVID recovery, part of that recovery is a green recovery as well, in order to rethink how we work and how we build jobs and aid businesses. And if we thought that, as Kevin suggested, and you've got my backing, Kevin, as you know, as a former Yorkshire MP, and we've been co-chairs on groups before, to recognise that many of our SMEs miss out time and time again when it comes to financing from banking. What we can't have as we go forward with our green agenda is a missing out on getting access to the resources for them to be able to transform their businesses, their design, their management, their training, the products they use, their supply chains, because once again, they're squeezed out by the bigger players who often have access to funding that these businesses, we know, sadly don't. It is about recognising that we have to decarbonise. And again, our launch report, Alex, showed that in many respects we have made progress. And a lot of that has been to do with moving to a cleaner, greener agenda. It has been to do with transforming our energy in more recent decades, which is all positive and very welcome. But another aspect of why we have got our emissions down is because we have deindustrialised our economy. And there are consequences of that. Places like Doncaster that were built on coal, and, you know, I have never shied away from the fact that there has to be a cleaner future for places like Doncaster. But as those towns and communities lost their jobs associated with those high emitting industries, or manufacturing moved overseas where employment law and other factors like less high standards in terms of quality and environment were the game, we lost jobs. And yes, it brought our emissions down, but it brought it down at a price. And we ended up importing more products that were built and made to less standards. So, I mean, on that one issue alone, some border carbon adjustments in terms of tax is got to be on the table for discussion here. Because again, if we're going to bring communities with us to make the changes, they have to feel that their effort here at home is actually paying dividends and not being lost out to just buying in goods from elsewhere that aren't playing by the same rules. I'll just end on, because I know we want to get to questions. I believe that in the way our country has faced the coronavirus in the last year, it shows that when needs must, we can. We can make massive challenges in a relatively short space of time, and we can harness and collaborate in a way that normal business doesn't seem to achieve. And I think we need to take the spirit of that going forward. Just like in the last year, we need big, bold initiatives to make a difference. The collaboration to create vaccines between the public and the private sector and government behind it has made the world of difference. We have shown that we can make products when we need to. And that's a sort of, I think, that's a sort of tone and the sort of collaboration that we need going forward. And we have got something to our advantage here in the UK. I'm a Labour person, Caroline's a Conservative person. There'll be things we disagree on. But when it comes to climate change, we have more consensus at the political level in this country that many other countries have. And we should make sure we use that in every possible opportunity to not only do the right thing, but to lead the way. And the biggest chance for that is going to be both at the G7 and at the COP26 in the autumn. and I hope we will, and I hope we'll be able to come away with that, with good ideas, with joined up thinking, with an international deal, but most importantly, a more direct answer to the roadmap for going forward.
Thank you, Caroline. We've had Nigel Topping join us now. I know we've only got Nigel for a limited amount of time, so I'm going to go to Nigel next and then come back round to Caroline Spelman. You're the filling between the Caroline sandwich today. And Nigel is the UK's high-level ambition champion for COP26, so it's a real pleasure to have him. Over to you, Nigel.
Thanks, Alex, and pleasure to join you. I'm sorry it's so brief. Yeah, I should explain what I'm actually. It's a very long-winded title. I'm sorry, the UN decided that. I'm the high-level climate action champion. So let me just explain that for those of you who don't know. That's a role that was created in Paris by the parties to the UN Climate Convention in recognition of the fact that national governments can't do this on their own. We need regional governments, cities, and the private sector in particular to drive ambition. What they call non-party stakeholders. So I'm appointed by the UK government as presidency, but I worked to that mandate globally. And that mandate includes basically being pushy, so telling everybody they've got to do it faster and they can do it faster, but then also trying to join the dots so that we converge, and in particular those non-state actors support countries around the world in going faster. Just a quick reflection on the question of are we on the road to a zero carbon economy and a green recovery? I think the honest answer is it's half full, the glass, and there's a lot more to be done. We know John Kerry yesterday made the point, and we all know that the current commitments in the recent UNFCCC report, and even in the UK, we haven't got enough policy clarity yet, so to match the ambition. I think we all know that. So I think everyone, my background is in the private sector, running factories in Manchester and businesses in Hartlepool. So certainly as a manufacturing guy, we want long-term policy clarity to justify the investments. But I am really positive because we've seen such a rapid rate of progress, since the UN's General Assembly in 2019, when the first net zero commitment started to be made. We've now had a massive increase. We've now got over 70% of the world's economy committed to net zero. We launched the Race to Zero last summer. We now got over 3,000 businesses, cities, regions, investors committed in a robust way. There's a lot of non-robust net zero commitments, but in the Race to Zero, we've made sure that there's a robust claim. It's particularly relevant to the UK, I think, is given the strength of the finance sector, is the way that the finance community is very quickly coming on board. We launched the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative in December. We're hoping to have $1 trillion of assets under management, already got 9 trillion. And you're going to hear more announcements this week and almost every week between now and Glasgow. So the whole finance community's got it, and UK is a real centre. That's a real opportunity. I really echo Caroline's point about the opportunity of this sort of path through the Climate and Development Summit, the Americans April 22nd Leadership Summit, the G7, CHOGM, G20. We've got a unique involvement at a high level in more summits than probably any country's ever been involved in 1 year. But really important is that we do talk about the financing of this transition, because there's a lot of focus rightly on the 100 billion, and the UK has taken a lead and made that a clear focus of its presidency in terms of the commitment to public-private finance from north to south. But we need trillions of dollars to be mobilized, and that's going to mostly be private sector finance. So we need to look a lot more at leverage. I think that we should also really look at this much more as a competitive opportunity than as some sort of burden. The UK's got amazing engineering capability tucked away in the Climate Change Committee's recommendations for the 2050, in line with 2050, is a scenario which says if we drive technology change much faster, we can get to net zero by 2042. So, my view would be, as an industrialist and as someone who believes in the power of engineers, is that we should be thinking about moonshots for 2042 and getting really clear on what has to happen and making sure policy and public and private action are driving those. That's why, for example, we in our guys launched the Green Hydrogen Catapult with 7 big energy players committed to get 25 gigawatts of green hydrogen electrolysis by 2025, which is the point we know is needed to get the cost down to be competitive with fossil fuels. So I agree with Caroline. I think we can be confident. We should be big and bold. Engineers and capital markets respond really well to that. we've recently launched, and Alok Sharma launched it at the Davos Dialogues at the end of January, what we call the Race to Zero breakthroughs, trying to be much clearer about what's the short-term actions we need in terms of getting a critical mass of major players in every sector to commit to the Race to Zero, and then what's the actual change in the economy that we need to see, whether it's those 25 gigawatts of hydrogen or the increased percentage of sustainable aviation fuel, or every sector has its own milestone. We really need to focus on the next 5 years. So I would say, back to the question, we're not on track yet, but we have a framework internationally in the Paris Agreement with the ratchet progress, and nationally with the 5-yearly cycles and the renewed 2050 commitment to really use that to drive jobs creation and competitiveness. Because the one thing that everybody is understanding around the world is this is an inevitable transition. And people who commit the boldest actually will reap disproportionate rewards. The people who are slow are going to lose market share and take a bigger economic hit than those who lead.
Nigel, that's really helpful and help frame this for us in the run up to COP.
Let me just I want to give one really important example of this. I worked in the automotive industry when I was in manufacturing. UK was a leader when it committed to 2040 phase out for combustion engines, and it's really leapfrogged to be a leader with the 2030 commitment. It's the only country with a significant car production industry which has made such a bold. Others have said 2025, but if you're not making cars, there's no jeopardy there, right? But I speak to CEOs in the car industry now. They all know this is happening in the 2030s, right? Whether it's 2030 or 2035, no one quite knows. But having the courage to legislate to be the first to make these transitions can only drive investment in the kind of jobs and innovation and supply chain. So I would just really encourage everybody to think about the competitiveness premium of being bold, because these things are going to happen anyway. And if you do it 5 years after everybody else, you get no benefit.
Yeah. Securing those gigafactories is going to be absolutely vital to making those batteries for the drivetrain. So finally, in this panel, we've got Caroline Spelman, who was the Shadow Secretary for Environment, Farming and Rural Affairs. I knew one Caroline was under the last Labour government, which is a while ago now, and stood down in the last Parliament, and again is working along Caroline and a range of others on this new Getting to Zero commission. So over to you, Caroline.
Thank you very much, Alex, and I'm enjoying very much co-chairing with Caroline Flint, because I think this really is a cross-party issue par excellence. We're going to have to tackle this across governments of different persuasion over a long time. So I think the more we can build consensus between us, the more likely we are not to waste time, points scoring off each other. So I'm very attracted to the work that Onward has done, because it gets right down to a granular level of how each constituency would be affected. So if there are a member of Parliament watching in, and some of you are on the screen now, I mean, you can actually see how our move to net zero will affect your constituency. And the reason why that is so important is because there are very stark contrasts, and the 10 least vulnerable constituencies are quite often in cities and London centric, and the 10 most vulnerable constituencies are actually distributed around the country, but as Caroline Flint said, a lot of them already in places where we recognise people already feel unequal, left behind, and this is something we are sounding the alarm on. Not because we think we shouldn't go to net zero, because we have to, absolutely, but because we need to mitigate any negative impact as far as possible and make sure that the people who are most vulnerable are really considered in the decisions and the policies that we come up with. So I think there's no doubt in my mind that we've made progress towards net zero, very much so in the energy sector, but we've got to have a really big push now on getting carbon reduction in the domestic sector. And there's a really good thumbnail sketch, and actually one of the contributors to the chat has used this figure that on average it would cost at least £10,000 per household to actually modify these dwellings to net zero. But the Treasury will tell us that the average level of savings for these households is only £1,000. So there's a big gap that's got to be filled somehow. And that will inevitably be a combination of public and private. And I, for one, recognise the value of a new infrastructure bank. But a lot of resource will have to come in through the private sector. But it is also a huge opportunity. You know, if you take all those dwellings that have got to be modified, that's a veritable army of people it's going to require to do the modification. And so as Onwards research evolves, one of our next chapters, upcoming chapters, is on skills. You know, we have to train people to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. Because otherwise, what will we do? We will have to import the labour, and that's become more difficult since Brexit. So there are some really important challenges which we want to sound the alarm on, but we don't want that to be construed as opposition to the move to net zero, because, you know, as I say to people, say, well, we can't afford to do this. And actually, there've been quite a few articles in newspapers recently around, you know, do you realise what this is going to cost us? And my answer to that is we can't afford not to do this. You know, there's an absolute moral imperative, and we have to find the way to do it without making people who are already vulnerable even more vulnerable. And we will pay a very high price if we do that. In the chat, there's a very interesting question about whether we should be offsetting the position of countries like China. Well, I would say, especially with Nigel on the call, Nigel, you've got to come up with, you know, a really successful outcome from COP26. No pressure. I had 2 UN summits under my belt, the Secretary of State. One was the Nagoya summit, at which the whole world agreed to tackle the loss of biodiversity. And the second one was Rio plus 20 and the outcome of sustainable development goals from that summit. But the UK in the chair is going to need some really bold, attractive ideas if that's going to be written up as a success. And I fully support what Caroline said about carbon border adjustment. If you want to get the Chinese to really feel that they must change on carbon emissions, then we need to put a value on the carbon in the imports which we bring in from China. Otherwise, we keep ducking the question of exporting the jobs overseas to countries that are big carbon emitters or don't regulate as strictly as we do. And we'll never address that question. And, you know, if you take some of the things John Kerry had to say yesterday, I mean, it is quite a thought that if you put the US, the EU, Japan together, you have 60% of the world's GDP. And if those countries are signed up, and thank God the Americans have re-signed, if you take their commitment to tackle climate change, you know, we really, with this summit at the end of this year, Nigel, you can achieve your, what's it they want to call you? Climate action, high ambition champion. Well, we want you to succeed, but, you know, it will take the political will to achieve that. And it will take some really bold, brave ideas to get everybody facing the same way. So, you know, back to my original point, you know, this is something we can't afford not to do, but we have to find a way to do it, mitigating the impact on the most vulnerable that we live amongst.
Thank you. We are a little behind time, but Nigel, have you got time just to maybe address one question? I mean, Caroline sort of posed a question, and we've got a question in the chat from Suki Chong, who asks whether the panel, but I'll address it to you, and maybe the others will want to pick it up, think that we will get I can't quite find the question now, but basically get a binding agreement at COP26, a higher level binding agreement at this COP26.
Well, I think it is really important to understand the technical construct of the UNFCCC and what is technically deliverable at COP26. So COP26 is not a renegotiation of the global climate convention, right? The big deal was done in Paris, which established the goals and the mechanism. So COP26 is in many ways a test of whether the Paris mechanism is working. It's not a renegotiation. So it's important people understand that, because if people expect Alok Sharma as president to pull a completely new negotiated binding agreement out of a hat, they're already disappointed because it's not going to happen. So there are some very important technical aspects which need to be delivered around carbon markets, so-called Article 6, and some commitments that have already been made, like the 100 billion of financing from developed countries to developing countries, which have to be delivered, which is why he and the UK government are focused on that. But the two big tests are going to be, have all the countries ratcheted their ambition? You know, all the national plans added up to about a 3.2 degree trajectory in Paris. That's going to come down. The question is, will it be getting close to 2 degrees or not? It won't get as low as 1.5 degrees, but if it goes down from 3.2 to 2, then we're still got chance in the next cycle to keep cranking it down further. And is the real economy moving? Will we start to really believe that the combustion engine, which, remember, in 2015 in Paris, the IEA was saying we're still going to be building combustion engines into the 2080s. And now I think that if we land the sort of big announcements and the sense that everyone's committed to that coming forward by 50 years, that's really radical. So I don't expect too much out of the negotiations. If you overload expectations, you'll be disappointed, because what is negotiable is already been set and is in train. But do expect and put pressure on governments to match the UK's level of ambition. 68% by 2030 is huge, and I love the fact that previous speakers have made the point that it's bipartisan here. That's so important, right? Is that we all recognise the benefit of it, and it doesn't become a political ping pong game. So I'd say it's what national governments are coming up with, and there will be lots of pressure on those, like John Kerry and Alok Sharma are going around the world now telling those who haven't ratcheted that they really need to ratchet, and they'll start to realise it's an international competitiveness issue. And then what are the private sector doing, and private sector and local government. I mean, I was just on a call this morning. Edinburgh, Glasgow, London, all the Manchester, all of our major cities have got much more ambitious goals. So it'll be a combination of making sure the negotiations work respectfully for the 190 plus countries, many of whom are small and least developed countries, who really feel their agency almost uniquely in the UN Climate Convention, where it's a consensus process. So you almost have single party veto. But so we need national governments to step up, but we really need to see the momentum from the real economy in Glasgow. And I think we have the possibility of making Glasgow the first implementation summit where we have more emphasis on those issues, like how fast are we phasing out coal, how fast are we phasing out combustion engines, and less emphasis on the negotiations, because we're not renegotiating the whole deal.
Thanks, I think that's really useful explainer there, that we aren't renegotiating the whole deal. We're just moving on from Paris. 6 years on, we need to upgrade the ambition of the Paris deal. I'm really pleased we've got a number of MP colleagues joining us: Bill Esterson, Andrew Salu, Deirdre Brock, Trudy Harrison and Liz Twist. And before we move on to the next panel, I'll give them an opportunity to ask a question. Bill's camera's on. Does that mean you want to ask a question, Bill?
Well, you know by now, Alex, ask an MP if they want to ask a question, they're not going to say no. Thank you very much, all the panelists. This has been brilliant. The question that springs to mind is our geographical emissions, and the fact that because we are so dependent on imports, we actually we don't account for a lot of the emissions that we're responsible for. Thoughts from panelists on addressing this issue and the change in the concept and what needs to happen. One thought for me is it's an example of one of the reasons why we do need to reshore our manufacturing, among other things.
I mean, Caroline, I think you touched it in your talk. Do you want to address this first? Yeah.
Yeah, Bill, it's absolutely right. Some of the gains we've made, as I said, was because we offshored manufacturing elsewhere. And alongside the debate we're having about meeting zero carbon is also about how do we grow our economy, because we've got a lot of debt to pay down over the next 100 years as well. So all these things come together. I think part of it has to be about how, for example, we support manufacturing. We've shown we will still have to make things in the future, and some of the things we'll be making will be those innovative products that are helping us to meet our climate change challenge. So, whether it's extremely high tech from something like hydrogen or other power bases, or whether it's more low tech in terms of the everyday products we use and being greener and cleaner, I think there's a role for government to support business in this. And it goes back to the point about how do we help not just the big corporates, but also those small, medium-sized enterprises to get access to the knowledge as well as the finance to help them make that transition. And this is where, and a comment came up, Alex, on the chat about regionalisation and local. I think in this particular area, but also I would say on energy efficiency as well, we need to think about, yes, a national direction and support, but delivery as much as possible on a more regional and localised level. Because I think the best examples of energy efficiency at scale, and Caroline and I were talking about this earlier, have been between local authorities and the energy companies retrofitting low-value housing in their communities. They've done it to scale. What has failed, actually, has been the Green Deal and the Green Homes Grant. We don't seem to be able to get that side of it right. So whether it's delivering those energy efficiency measures on the domestic front, or for that matter, looking at how we help support businesses, connecting universities to SMEs, connecting the finance, and we've got the investment bank in Leeds, so you better make sure it works, Alex, for us. All those things, I think, yes, we have to have national policy and direction, but implementation and delivery, I think on the scale we need, closer to where people are, is better done on a more regional level.
Thanks, Caroline. I'm gonna bring Mike Hemsley on this, and then we're gonna go to Trudy Harrison for a question. Mike, I'm sure you must think about this in the carbon budgets team.
Yeah, we certainly do. So obviously the UK's obligations are for reducing its own domestic emissions, but we definitely don't ignore the wider emissions that the UK has through what we call consumption emissions as well. And Caroline's right, we have increased our impact on the world since we've started looking at this through consumption emissions as well. But the good news is they are falling. And we think they will fall towards net zero as well over the longer term. So we're looking at net zero emissions for the UK domestically by 2050. And what we did as part of the sixth carbon budget was plotted what we think could happen to consumption emissions over that period as well. And we think they could fall about 90%. So actually, that's pretty much in line, which is really good. And what I would point to is the net zero commitments coming from particularly Asia over the last year. China's saying net zero 2060, other countries are saying net zero 2050. Increasingly, what they're saying is the future of manufacturing is low carbon, not high carbon. And that's a massive step forward. What that then says, yes, maybe the UK should be thinking about reshoring manufacturing and making sure that the manufacturing base it has today can grasp the opportunities of a low carbon manufacturing economy. And we're seeing that start to come about in discussions around carbon border adjustments and things like that. So really some quite optimistic notes there, but definitely an issue that needs to be taken into account and something that we do monitor.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to next bring in Trudy Harrison, who represents Copeland in Cumbria. So Trudy, what's your question?
Thank you very much, Alex. We proudly host the large proportion of the nuclear industry, but to build a Rolls-Royce small modular reactor would take about 180,000 tonnes of steel. And I'm sure you all know, I also have the proposed West Cumbria coal mine in my constituency, which has a huge amount of support locally, recognising the challenges that brings. I wonder what the panel consider to be the way forward for blast furnaces, and particularly given that 75%, I think, of steel across the world is produced with blast furnaces, the kind of carbon capture that might be possible to deal with that. I noticed that Miles Allen is also involved with this call, who has what I think is a very significant proposal in this area. So appreciate views on that. Thank you very much, Alex. It's been really interesting.
Thanks, Trudy. We had a few in the chat about carbon capture as well. I'm sure this is something that Onward must be thinking about. So I'll go to Caroline Spelman, see if she's got any thoughts on this.
Just unmute. So the optics of the coal mining in Cumbria, Trudy, the optics are difficult in the run-up to the COP26, obviously. I'm not a steel technician, but I understand there's an article in yesterday's Daily Telegraph that said that the kind of coke that would be produced actually would most likely be exported, and that's was quite news to me, but maybe helps to explain why the domestic steel industry has been a bit silent on this subject. Because I initially heard the argument was made that from a from a holistic point of view, you might be better off producing the coke in this country rather than having to import it with all the carbon emissions associated with bringing it here. But actually, if in point of fact that argument is not true, I would like to know.
Just to come back on that, the Telegraph article actually uses misinformation. It was the sulfur content in the coking coal. If it got to 1.7, it would not be of interest to the blast furnaces in this country, but it's actually more likely to be 1.1, which would be of interest. And the point really, I suppose, is rather than the coking coal coming from places like Australia, it would go from Whitehaven to Rotterdam, which is an 18-hour journey, but it's not actually the extraction, because blast furnaces will use coking coal regardless. More about the scope 3 element of emissions that come from the blast furnace extraction of the coking coal.
Okay, so that's really helpful. Thank you for that. And I can answer that one of the incumbent industries that has done is that because it's a high emitter, is the steel industry. And whereas quite a few industries are pressing quite well down the track of reducing carbon, and automotive, as previously mentioned, is one example of that, steel actually poses some quite big challenges.
Thank you. Thank you. I've been told that we are really a long way behind time now, so I'm going to just thank all the speakers in that first panel, to both Carolines, Mike, Kevin, and Nigel and Abena, who have had to leave. We're going to now move on to the industrial panel, and I'd encourage you all to stay if you can stay as well. So before, I've got a bit of echo line. I don't know whether that is from another person being not on mute. Oh, that's a lot better. That's great. Thanks very much. But before I go on to the next panel, I just want to thank our sponsors who've been supporting us in this APPG, so we can do all this work and then look forward to hopefully a good presence and COP. And those are Atkins, WSP, National Grid, Barratt Developments, EDF, Exchequer, Inspired Energy, and the University of Oxford, who are doing a write-up of today and working with us on the report. So the second panel, the industrial panel, who should be coming forward, we've got Carys Roberts from IPPR, as the Director of IPPR, Martin McTague, who's the Vice Chair Policy Advocacy of the FSB, Tej Parikh, who's the Chief Economist of the IOD, Georgina Penfold, who's Director at Inspired Energy, Jim Coleman, the Head of Economics, WSP, and Paul Spence, Director of Strategy and Corporate Affairs at EDF, who's just here for the Q&A, because time is against us. So I think we're going to go straight over to Carys.
Thanks very much, Alex, and thanks also for the opportunity to speak to everyone today. As Alex said, I'm Executive Director at IPPR, where we host the Environmental Justice Commission. So this is a 2-year programme setting out a plan for a transition to net zero that's fair and just, and also looks at the restoration of nature. And it's got cross-party chairs, so very much speaking to the comments here today about the need for this to be a truly cross-party agenda. As part of that work, we've been speaking to people across the country through citizens' juries, so in Tees, Aberdeenshire, South Wales and Thurrock. And something that's coming through really clearly is that the people we speak to want faster action on both climate and nature, and that they strongly believe that that needs to be fair. So it's very clear that that process has to be fair to secure their consent. Are they getting that faster action? Well, we think that there have been some really important announcements, most notably the 10-point plan last year. We wanted that to be a stepping stone on the path to net zero, but in our view, I'd echo some of the comments from earlier, that the budget failed to adequately build on that. So we think that we should be making that the government should be making bolder plans in order to reach its own targets. We also think that needs to be a whole economy approach, so it needs to be driven by an overarching industrial strategy, and I'll say a bit more about this in a moment. We were a little bit concerned to see the new plan for growth that is Treasury-led, because we felt that rather than building on the very good elements of the 2017 industrial strategy, it seemed to abandon that and start something else. So obviously we'll need to wait to see how that progresses. But that was an area of slight concern for us in light of the budget. We do think that more investment is needed. So we previously estimated that we think we need about 30 billion a year to deliver net zero, but also to restore nature and ensure a just transition, which, as I said in my opening remarks, is really critical to getting the political buy-in for this. But there are really clear benefits from doing so. So our research has shown that this could create up to 1.6 million jobs in the low carbon economy by 2030. And that crucially, these would be well distributed around the country. So for instance, over 250,000 jobs could be created in greening housing stock, and that would be very evenly spread across the country because our homes are, to put it quite simply. In terms of the, we were asked some questions specifically about industrial strategy and how government and business should work together and so on. And the point I wanted to make really was that a key role for government is to set direction and provide early investment, because this can provide certainty for businesses that are making their own investment plans and can also leverage in private investment over time. So often public and private investment can be held up kind of in conflict with one another. We don't think that's right. Instead, done well and with that policy certainty, public investment can crowd in private investment. And then I think in terms of the industrial strategy, it also needs to be really closely aligned with skills policy, and that to identify the gaps here, government will need to work really closely with business and also local leaders to identify what needs to be done. So in terms of that industrial strategy, as I said, policy certainty is really, really important here. And an example of where we think this has gone wrong recently would be the Green Homes Grant, in that this was announced for a short period and then has subsequently had its funding cut substantially. Whereas we know that if the private sector is to invest, including in skills and training, it needs to know that the demand is there and that the commercial opportunities are there. The other point that I just finish on is that we were asked about the National Infrastructure Bank and the objectives that should have. And the bank already has net zero as an objective, which is really good to see. But at the moment, this isn't absolute and conditional. So not every investment that the bank makes has to be compliant with net zero. So we would support calls for stronger requirements that everything that the bank and the government invests in is net zero compliant, because we think that action is really critical to take us forward at the speed that is required to, as other speakers have commented, to make sure that the UK is competitive in the race for net zero and to meet the demands of people that we're speaking to around the country to make sure that we get to net zero as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Carys. And we'll go over to Martin at the FSB next.
Thanks, Alex. I think I'll start with what is clearly the fact, a positive, which is that ambition is great. You know, there's this target of 64% by 2030. There's a 10-point plan. There's the energy white paper. Where we think that the plans are lacking is implementation. I mean, it was clearly a COVID budget rather than a green budget. There are some good initiatives, you know, with offshore wind and hydrogen, but we're still waiting for heat and building strategy and the environment bill. So there's still big gaps, and we're getting very close to COP26. As far as small business is concerned, it's very clear to us that a small number of big companies won't deliver this. There needs to be the millions of small businesses in the UK need to get behind this initiative, otherwise it's not going to succeed. And for many of them, they are absolutely loaded under at the moment with COVID debt. And that has to be a fundamental starting point if we're going to get them to invest in the future of more green technology. The principles that we want to apply to that change, we've outlined with the other 5 business organisations, which include Tejas IOD, CBI and the rest. We're saying that their plans have to be ambitious but realistic, that the government needs to coordinate the activities between departments, not have this initiative-itis that happens with each department, that you have to have allow diversity, don't go for a one-size-fits-all approach. You have to have a level playing field where every business has got an equal chance of investing in this technology. And you must make sure that the transition costs are distributed evenly. At the moment, it's not clear whether they will land on the consumer, on the businesses involved, or on the government. And I think it needs to be very clear that those costs for transition are shared evenly. As far as the levelling up is concerned, it's clear to us that there needs to be more spent on infrastructure, road, rail and buses. In the classic red wall seats, that is a big gap in provision. Broadband will make a massive difference to how those parts of the country are able to respond. And also local energy generation will enable them to become much more independent of some of the other initiatives. In terms of investment targets, electric vehicles, the charging infrastructure is pitiful at the moment. Still a lot has to be done on that. Workplace charging is still not open to SMEs, and it doesn't really make any sense to us that that isn't happening. HGVs will have to have some sort of scrappage scheme. There is no way businesses will be able to make the transition away from petrol and diesel in adequate numbers unless there's a scrappage scheme. As far as energy is concerned, data is absolutely essential to making sure we distribute energy transmission. Efficiency, we've talked a lot about insulation, but there is a possibility of investing in heat as a service that could make a dramatic difference to how our homes are heated in the future. And in terms of generation, it's not yet clear how these micro generation schemes will be funded. And finally, on jobs and skills, Help to Grow included help on leadership and management. It also included help on software. What was missing is green skills. I think that could have been an inclusion in the Help to Grow provisions. And we're still woefully short on technical skills. The idea that we can somehow roll out 600,000 heat pumps without an infrastructure to deal with that and the technical resources to deal with that seems fanciful. I'll leave it at that, Alex.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Martin. That was really helpful. So we're now going to move on to Tej from the IOD.
Hi there. So we've been speaking about cross-party coalitions and cross-country and international coalitions. I think that the charge towards net zero is going to really require cross-business coalition as well. So not just focusing on the large polluters, the manufacturers, but also looking, as Martin said, on the SME communities. Now, we know that small businesses play a crucial role in the supply chain for larger organizations. They play a massive part in innovation that can support the decarbonisation agenda, and also in the, generally speaking, the products and services they provide. So what I wanted to do was just kind of take a look at how, you know, change might take place within any SME to become more carbon friendly or to move towards net zero. And I think there are two key barriers for any business, whether it's small or large. The first is obviously cost, cash flow challenges, limited capital and uncertainty. The second is expertise. You know, many businesses might not know the best approach to reduce their carbon footprint. They may have challenges around measuring their existing carbon footprint and reporting. Now, looking specifically at the first one on cost, I think incentives are absolutely crucial here. So the budget did outline this super deduction in capital allowances. Now that offers some support on things such as charging stations and solar panels, but it may exclude some SMEs that might hire their capital, and it might more broadly, due to definitions, exclude other forms of carbon-friendly technology. So there is a big question around whether we need to go back to a world in which we had enhanced capital allowances on green specific kind of technologies. And as Martin outlined, you know, whether the measures outlined in the budget could also be extended not only to green skills, but also to green investments. So we saw the Help to Grow digital vouchers, but also we know that there is this wider kind of look at the R&D tax system and whether tax credits could be expanded to look at innovations in the green space. I think one element that was also missing from the budget was looking at how we can support equity growth in startups and scale-ups. Now, many of our members in this space are innovating massively and supporting the wider kind of charge towards net zero. But a lot of these innovative firms have limited access to the capital that they need. And I think more broadly speaking, we need to look at how the tax system holistically might disincentivize businesses investing in their green capabilities. We know that if a firm wants to invest in its solar panels, and that will, counterintuitively, that will also increase their business rates, and therefore there's a disincentive effect there to think of. The second factor is, of course, expertise. Now, many of our members might have difficulty, particularly the smaller ones, in understanding what is best practice in this space in terms of kind of improving their carbon footprint. And so we are going to need to look at how we can get professional advice out to the wider business community and raising literacy on decarbonisation and sustainability. And I think at a local level, creating coalitions that match, at least in England, local enterprise partnerships with business leaders, with education providers, course providers, and universities. So at least that way, skills demand can also keep up to speed with the supply of skills at the same time. And broadly speaking, around 70% of our members do believe that green roles are going to be a crucial part for the economic recovery. And I think there was limited kind of measures in the budget around specifically adding on a bolt on for green skills in many of the measures around management skills, apprenticeships, and traineeships, and what green kind of modules can be added to these things to kind of more broadly widen our literacy in this space. And just to kind of tie it very quickly, as Carys said, we need a bit more specificity and long-termism. And it's a shame that kind of the language of the industrial strategy has disappeared, because that helps coalesce business investment over the long term. But I think generally speaking, the government should maintain this kind of carrot approach. And for many business leaders, I think the pressure of ESG is already helping them push in the right direction for the changes that they want to see.
Thanks, Tej. We're now going on to Georgina, then we've got Jim, and then it's over to you for questions. So over to you, Georgina.
Thank you, Alex. Hello, everyone. So my name's George. I'm the Director for Regulated Services at Inspired Energy PLC, and we provide energy and carbon accounting, procurement and compliance services to just over 2,800 different organisations, public, private and third sector. So like Martin and Tej, I'm speaking from the viewpoint of a non-domestic energy consumer, in particular, the larger industrial and commercial consumers. What can I say about the budget? It wasn't the budget I was expecting, although if anyone on the call hasn't picked up on this yet, Treasury did release a comment saying that further detail, including some of the documents and consultations that would normally be published alongside the budget, is due to be released on the 23rd of March. So we shall wait and see what's included in that. Like Tej, we're very interested in the announcement on the super deduction capital allowance, enable companies to deduct 130% of the cost of investment in plant and equipment. And we do have a query with HMT to clarify kind of whether or what types of low carbon generation tech or things like more efficient heating and lighting would be eligible for that, because that could potentially be a really positive thing for business energy efficiency. In particular, and at the risk of copycatting Mike Hemsley earlier, we'd like to see a lot more focus on support to decarbonise heat. So many of our customers would love to look at heat pumps, fuel switching, or for the organisations like local authorities and social housing heat networks. But these are not a quick win. There's some really complex engineering and construction controls and decisions that you need to go through to replace conventional heating systems, particularly if we're starting to talk about hydrogen or heat networks. So there needs to be not only the investment to support for the physical infrastructure, but also the access to educational and delivery support to drive these projects forward. Caroline, Flint, Martin and Tej have all preempted me on that point. And I know I'm biased, but lack of in-house resource is as big a barrier as lack of finance for many organisations. So support for businesses to get help from experts like my colleagues must be a priority. A recent grant scheme, as an example for the public sector, was notionally designed to support heat decarbonisation, but in practice, the timescales for delivery were just so tight that very few heating system developments or upgrades could realistically be specified, procured and rolled out, delivered in the time frame demanded. So initiatives like that need to be considered much more carefully, so that we put investment into those projects that might not have the shortest payback period, but will deliver the greatest social and environmental impact over the long term. In all of this, I'd also like to see a lot more conversation on security and resilience of our electricity transmission distribution networks, in particular in rural areas. I know the APPG talks a lot about regional challenges and how we're not all the same. Whilst it's absolutely right to talk about electrification of heat and transport, the reality is that there are areas of the UK that are not on the gas grid, where electrical blackouts are still more common than you'd think, and where there is no mass transport. So investment in technology like energy storage, which will support grid resilience and or enable businesses to have a greater degree of self-reliance, is crucial. Rural areas often are also economically deprived areas, and we must not leave them behind. Should finance be conditional upon clear net zero business plans? That's not something that I can do justice to in the time available, but because there's a lot of social nuances like I've just touched on. But what I am keen to see is the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure officially introduced and enshrined in law as a mandatory requirement for UK companies. TCFD would require businesses to report on their climate risk and response alongside their annual accounts. So my customers' accountants and auditors may not be quite so keen, but they already publish energy and carbon data, so it's the natural next step. And once it's in place, I do believe that the benefits will quickly become evident. So sections of the finance insurance sectors are already reporting. We're expecting wider disclosure to kick in from April 2022. It's not been confirmed yet, but if we want business and indeed government to really take decarbonisation seriously, we've got to have that analysis so that we understand what climate change means in real terms, both the risks faced by British businesses and the opportunities. What new markets might we be able to unlock? Without that insight, net zero is still an aspiration for 2050, which is a bit too far off to really focus people's minds. So on that note, and to wrap up, I personally would be very supportive of a tightening around interim targets to make sure that we're on track to deliver.
Thank you, Georgina. And last but not least, it's Jim, and then we'll have a couple of quick questions because we're going to have to wrap up. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much, Alex. So I'm Jim Coleman, Head of Economics at WSP. WSP is a global engineering-led multidisciplinary consultancy company. We're working on many aspects of net zero, and we have our own net zero goals internally that we've signed up to. And I'm an economist, but most of my colleagues are engineers, and they're working on the technicalities of net zero processes and technologies for a whole range of clients. One of the projects we've worked on very recently is to develop the net zero strategy for the West Midlands Combined Authority, and focusing on the first 5 years, the first 5-year action plan as part of that strategy. And it's given us a really granular insight into some of the challenges on the ground at a sub-regional level in terms of the realities of moving in this direction. And there are strong aspirations, as there are nationally. Their goal is 2041, net zero 2041. And some things that have emerged from that experience and other experiences, I think probably reflect a lot of what's already been said. So I'm probably providing almost a summary of the whole event. I think one of the things is when we think of the net zero pathway, in the pathway that's starting to be defined by the Committee for Climate Change and others, what is the industrial transformation response to that pathway? What is the industrial transformation process for businesses as a whole, for key sectors, and for individual businesses? How do we blend research and development to generate new technologies, translate that into products that can be taken on by businesses, and then enable businesses to expand? It's quite a lot of different things. It's a kind of pathway and a trajectory. I think there's a big issue around sequencing and timing. When is the best point for a business to invest in that new technology, to move into a new market, to take advantage of what will be very substantial opportunities from net zero? Because if the timing is wrong, that really affects cash flow. It really affects return on investment. And I think there's a lot more needed there in terms of trying to unpack that industrial transformation process that's going to lie at the heart of net zero. How it's supported, how it's regulated, the incentives that are provided at the right time, at the right phase of a business journey or a business life cycle, all very important. And it also needs to be directed towards ensuring that these decarbonisation processes that become industrial opportunities, sectoral opportunities, that they are captured here in the UK. We've also done work quite recently looking at the offshore wind sector in the northeast. And it's a sector that's evolving. Again, huge opportunity. A lot of the expertise comes from other places. Other countries are delivering offshore wind energy for the UK through their own investment in expertise. It's not necessarily captured here in the UK as an economic opportunity. It's generating renewable energy, and that's very positive, but we're losing out on some of those supply chain opportunities, some of those additional employment generation and upskilling opportunities in regions of the UK that need it. The budget, we saw the National Infrastructure Bank. It's a great development that is coming. Obviously, it's about infrastructure. I'm not sure how much of it is going to be about technology that can go into businesses and sectors. It is a bank at the end of the day. It needs to get a return on its investment. Is that going to affect how risk averse it's going to be? Is it going to affect attitude to risk? Does that mean we're going to be able to push those high risk elements of net zero infrastructure and net zero capability that we need? The second point I want to make is something I'm very interested in personally as an economist, and it's everything around what happens to the labour market, job creation, job destruction as a result of net zero. Net zero decarbonisation pathways represent an economic restructuring. The last time we had a big economic restructuring from industry and manufacturing to services, it left a lot of people behind. It did not pull everyone with it. And I think this is the risk of net zero and something we need to avoid. Understanding again the creation of new jobs. Our work with the West Midlands suggests that even by 2026, there will be 20,000 new low carbon jobs as a result of the net zero action plan that they adopt. It's not 20,000 in just a few years. How will people transition into those jobs in the short term and also in the long term? We need to know what the jobs are. We need to specify the skills as closely as we can so that the education sector can respond quickly and in real time. Not just the HE sector with its specialisms in higher level skills and research and development, but very importantly, the FE sector, the further education sector. It trains most of the people most of the time. It's very important that that sector is enabled to upskill communities all over the country to make sure that net zero happens. Final point, both of these things, this kind of industrial transformation process from net zero, the labour market, the skills development opportunities, they also play into the levelling up agenda. And levelling up in conjunction with post-COVID recovery it's a very near-term thing that we need to deal with. So balancing short-term and longer-term opportunities, very important. I think through the work that I've done with lots of different local authorities, combined authorities across the country, we need to think about how this is devolved, regionalized, localized. Every area is different in its starting point, in its existing skills base, its existing industrial heritage, its existing sectoral characteristics. So everyone, needs to move at a different pace or to take account of different drivers, different constraints. So some kind of devolving of these things or taking them to the regional level. And it's one of the things we saw in the West Midlands. There are particular characteristics about that sub-region that means it needs to respond to net zero and all these opportunities in a particular way, and therefore may need to control certain things that maybe it doesn't control right now, particularly with regard to skills, education, the business support services. We've heard about getting that expertise into local businesses. Martin, Tej and Georgina all said that. How do you get that expertise into the business to enable the business to transition? That's probably something that needs to be localized in a way that understands the nuances of how businesses behave in particular locations. So yeah, probably a summary of everything everyone else has said there. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Jim. That was really useful. We're just going to go for 2 questions. So first of all, to Deirdre Brock and then to Rebecca Groundwater from the Energy Industries Council. Over to you, Deirdre.
Right, thanks, Alex. Listen, I wanted to ask, it's possibly a question for Jim and for Georgina, but it was just about the national grid and the scale of investment that's going to be required, the sort of anticipatory spend, in order to get it up to scratch to deal with the big increase in electric vehicles, for example, and extra reliance on it for heating, cooking, and so on, domestic uses. Because it seems to me that a failure to do that really will be laying down big problems for the future. And also just about the transmission charging scheme, because obviously we produce a lot of energy through renewables up in Scotland, but the cost of hooking up with the transmission, with the grid is such that it is having a detrimental effect on companies wanting to take part in really exciting things like marine energy and obviously offshore wind, floating wind, and so on. So I'd be interested to hear your views on that.
So maybe start with you, Georgina, then go to Jim to give him a moment to recover.
Yeah, sure. Wow, Deirdre, that's a big question. So I completely agree with what you've pointed out, that we need to invest in the grid infrastructure. This is not going to be cheap or easy. And actually, the Office for Budget Responsibility always puts out things on the same day as budget. If you look at what they are anticipating Treasury receipts on environmental levies are going to be, so they're the things that pay for contracts for difference, for example, which is funding low carbon generation. These are going up quite substantially over the next few years. COVID has also taken a real toll on National Grid and the DNOs. So they are going to have to recoup some of that as best they can over the next few years. And the knock-on impact of all of this is that consumer bills are not looking too pretty. Now that is a problem because it becomes counterproductive. If we're having to give everything to our energy supplier, we can't invest in the things that we need to invest in to reduce our reliance on the grid in the first place. I don't have an answer for you, but I would be very, very keen to see a lot more sort of discussion about how we support National Grid in a way that's not coming through the energy bills. It's not fair to continually keep putting more and more and more onto businesses and domestic consumers, because those that can afford to have the right kind of assets and the right geographical location to load, shift and get out of it do. And those that can't are left. There has been changes from Ofgem to address that recently, and from April 2022, the way that transmission charges are passed on to consumers is going to change. So it will step us towards that, but it's not going to do enough, I don't think. I think we're going to see a lot more change to come in the next few years around transmission and distribution in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, I'm sure WSP, as a infrastructure consultant, must be some thoughts about this, about the grid.
Well, National Grid is a WSP client, actually, from time to time. Different parts of there are many different parts of National Grid, obviously. I mean, I agree with Georgina, actually. I think that National Grid it's a national asset. It's a nationally important infrastructure system, and therefore needs to be treated maybe separately, because so many things hang off what happens with National Grid in terms of the decarbonisation of energy, the ability to go along that pathway, and also the ability to release all of the economic opportunities that go alongside that. So, it's a kind of nationally significant player and a nationally significant component in the whole thing. So I think, the business case that National Grid should be supported very directly and subsidized in ways that can yield all sorts of downstream benefits to different industries, different parts of the country, in order that we can actually generate all of the benefits that we need to generate. But the case needs to be made, I think, possibly for seeing this asset system in a different way, and as Georgina said, not just end up with things being passed down to the consumer to carry the cost of at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you.
And then the last question, we're going to go to Rebecca Groundwater from the Energy. I can't remember the name of your organisation. I'm sure you'll tell us.
Yep, Energy Industry Council. Thank you.
That's it.
Very quickly, we have nearly 700 members. 80% are members of the UK energy supply chain businesses, so that's across all energy sectors. And 20% are partners to UK businesses in 29 different countries. But what we're finding is that they are choosing diversification as their primary strategy. 25% diversifying from oil and gas, but 70% are moving out of energy completely, because there's not yet this pipeline of projects despite the rhetoric around it. Also, due to the investment that's due to be made during the next 5 years across all of the energy sectors, so floating offshore wind, CCUS, hydrogen and energy storage will make up just 2% of global capex. So this equates to approximately 130 billion compared to 4.2 trillion to be spent in the mature hydrocarbon and power sectors and 1.6 trillion on conventional renewable sectors. So we're seeing this supply chain in the UK really squeezed, with the next 12 months, previous 12 months having been difficult anyway. They're focusing on existing energy sectors rather than making the jump across to the new technologies. So my question was going to be around, we welcome the energy white paper, we welcome the rhetoric around jobs and skills, but actually we need to do more to keep that pipeline of energy supply companies in place. And we surveyed them at the beginning of the year. What they need and what they're looking for are grant funding to support the transition. They don't want to invest in education if there's the potential that actually these projects might not come down the line. And they're looking for some sort of recognition that the oil and gas supply chain are also leading the way in the energy transition piece, and those workers can move across to other energy sectors. So it's about pulling all of the energy piece together to make sure that the supply chain in the UK is rooted and seeded here in order to be able to deliver energy transition work globally as well, where they're already active. So I suppose that wasn't really a question, I'm very sorry, it was more of a yes, I agree, please can we have a bit more clarity around how we can drive this forward.
Yeah, Rebecca, I completely agree that lack of investment in the transition and into the clean tech is hugely worrying, and I'm not sure that the bank that we're going to have in Leeds is going to be the global solution to that with only a 12 million capitalisation. What I'm just going to do is go around the panel and just ask some closing thoughts, maybe wrapping up what Rebecca was saying as well. So we start maybe with you, Tej, from the IOD.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's clear that what we're looking for is an integrated approach here. So I think a number of us have touched upon, large business and small businesses in the supply chain need to play a role. It's not just skill sets and expertise of professionals who have a knowledge in this space, but also making sure that you lift that knowledge and expertise into businesses themselves, and ensuring that actually the literacy of business leaders and directors also kind of moves at the same time. And I think the third thing that I'd pick out is it's important that the government kind of reasserts this kind of long-term approach, because it's all well and good providing incentives for the short term, but if you're really going to kind of coalesce businesses together and actually encourage them to invest over the long term in their net zero strategy, you're going to need a clear path for that over the next 10 years.
Over to you, Martin, for any closing thoughts.
Just one closing thought, I think, is that we're committed to the transition as a country. We know we've got a clear objective. The real question remains is, how do we share out the costs of that transition? How much will fall on the consumer, how much will fall on the government, and how much will fall on the businesses that are supplying this technology? And I think that's the big open question right now. We have to, and I recognise that the net zero Treasury report will probably answer some of those questions, but it is crunch time now. That is the crucial decision we have to make, and very quickly.
Thanks, Martin. Georgina, any final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I think for me, really, it just comes down to collaboration. So I think across both the policymakers and business and industry, we kind of know what we ought to be doing. We need to kind of stop talking about it and start getting projects underway, and really putting that will behind it. If the will is there, then everything else, including the finance, I believe, will follow. So let's keep those networks strong.
Over to you finally, Jim.
Just final remark. I think we have more work to do to try and understand within the industries and the sectors that are really going to drive this: energy, construction, transport, etc. If we unpack the value chain for those industries and look into them and look at what triggers change, what type of incentive is going to be the most effective way to trigger a change, what type of investment where and at what time, because I think we just don't know enough yet about how different industries are going to make the transition in a successful way. Because if the instruments are too blunt, or if they're happening at the wrong time, then you can push kind of businesses into a very kind of difficult situation. I work a lot with I interact a lot with construction, the development sector, real estate development. And I still hear, when I say to some developers, it's all about net zero, get involved in net zero, that's the future buildings. Sometimes the response is, no, that's too expensive, we're not doing that. Well, you're going to be forced to do it eventually. So it's better to transition in the right way at the right pace. And I don't think we've got enough knowledge necessarily. I mean, the technologies change all the time, of course, which doesn't help. But we need to do some of that unpacking, I think, to understand across the value chain in the industry, what do you do at what point to really embed the change and get the switch to happen, I think.
Thanks, Jim. And just finally, just to thank everybody that's spoken today, all our panelists, all the members of Parliament that have come, all our sponsors, and all of you for attending. Please sign up to our mailing list and then carry on coming to our events on the road to COP26. And we've put in a bid to be in Glasgow, so hopefully we'll have a presence there as well, and we can see you all in person in Glasgow at the COP. Thanks very much. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Alex.
Bye-bye.